Welcome back to another episode of My BrainWise Coach. I am Cole Bastian.
And I'm Phil Dixon.
And if you are enjoying this conversation and you are enjoying going on this BrainWise journey with us, like, comment, share, subscribe, rate and review our podcast, wherever it is that you're getting this information from, because we want others to be able to find this community of BrainWise friends so that they too can go on this journey of living in a BrainWise fashion. And we are so glad to have you back with us, Phil. How are you feeling? Because last week, over the last 10 days or so, you've been unfortunately under the weather, and we've been sending you good vibes and prayers and all the things to help you feel better. So how are you today?
Feeling a lot better than I was the last 10 days. It's 10 or 12 days that I won't get back in my life. I don't know if it was flu or a cold or something different, but it got topped off by 6 inches of snow over this past weekend. We're having a great time.
I'm glad you're feeling better, as I know our BrainWise friends are as well. And then hopefully the snow will melt quickly where you are, because down here in the South, we're not big fans of snow. But without further ado, we've got a really great topic, Phil, I think, for this week. And thank you for helping to put it together and our talking points, which I think will be really apropos considering the kind of overall climate that we're in politically. So our topic is going to be on the neuroscience of politics, and not from a perspective of which side or what stance you might take. We want to be very clear on the front end and preface that this discussion is going to be entirely apolitical. We won't be interjecting our personal opinions on what this side's doing, what that side's doing, none of that. It's simply on the neuroscience and what's happening in all of our brains when it comes to politics and why we may get enraged by certain things or why things may trigger us more than others, and how our brains are reacting to the overall political climate, regardless of what side of the aisle, or if you're more centrist, you might sit on. So this is going to be, I think, a really good discussion to have, because right now the political climate can be a bit boiling over in some instances. And so I think taking a step back and looking at it from a non-emotional, non-judgmental, apolitical point of view, and just what's happening in our brains might help us to, as we each navigate our own experience, help us be able to navigate that even better.
Yeah, we're trying to, obviously this is a topic that we trot into carefully. And what we're trying to do is look at what's universal in the thinking process behind political thinking, and how our brains handle all those things about our self-identity, fairness, belonging, there's meaning to. So what we're trying to look at here is how we think about it, not what we think. And so to separate the two out.
And I think there's several things we're going to look at in terms of the conversation today. We're going to draw on some political neuroscience topics, cognitive linguistics, and then also the 5P model, or the PTP that we've just talked about on our podcast, to help make sense of it all, because there is a lot that is happening. And some people respond differently, and some people expect others to respond in the same way. And so why is all of that happening, and where is all of that coming from? So we can better manage ourselves, and then also maybe even learn a little bit about how to create relationships that are building in nature versus maybe more destructive in this particular landscape, because it can get quite interesting. So let's just start off with the basics, Phil. What is political neuroscience?
It's the study of how the brain processes political information. And if you double click on what we mean by political information, it's things like what do we perceive as threats? Don't forget, our brain looks for threats and rewards. What do we see in a threat and reward? And how does the brain manage itself in terms of uncertainty? And how about what happens when we know that other people actually agree with us and we feel like we belong to a group? So what we're going to be looking at is the cognitive processes and the emotional processes that go along underneath whatever it is you've made a decision about.
And there's some major contributors in that space, lending their voices to it.
There's been some huge amount, especially over the last 10 or 15 years. 10 or 15 years ago, there was a guy called, I think his name was George Lakoff, who worked in Berkeley. But since then, we've started having all sorts of researchers that have started looking at how do we take the fMRI processes that actually help us understand what's going on in the brain in terms of political decision making. And just very briefly, what that is It's a mechanism of looking into the brain. It looks at where the oxygen is most consumed in the brain, and we make assumptions from that about what parts of the brain are operating. And therefore, we can make some, hey, we know that this is always based on the emotional part, or this is based on a rational decision. And so we can now extend that when we put subjects into the fMRI machine and give them questions about political decision making. We can watch what's going on in their brains, not what their brains are thinking.
Which is really fascinating because it does certainly lend itself to helping us understand, because they'll ask different questions and different prompts, I assume, as a part of that process to see what's happening in the brain at that time.
Absolutely. And they're looking for patterns. They're looking for connectivity. They're looking for which areas get triggered right and left hemisphere. And they're not studying what it is the person is thinking. They're not studying the political content. What they're studying is the systems involved in how we make sense of what's really complex social information.
I think there were a couple of others, just in the event anyone who's listening wants to research some additional folks, but I'm going to probably butcher these names. So I'll say one or two, and then maybe Phil, you can jump in and say the others because you're much better. But Darren Schreiber, I think, is one. Ingrid Haas is another, because her work focuses on how emotion and uncertainty shape political judgments. And then there's several others that have gone on to provide additional context.
I'll add into that, the ones that I can pronounce, James Wilson and Skylar Cramner. And I'm sorry, but I will be butchering the other names as well.
Put it in the show notes.
Yeah, I was about to say, we'll put it in the notes if anybody asks for us.
Right.
But there's lots and lots of neuroscientists doing research into this situation.
One of the key points about these individuals we've talked about is these aren't necessarily scholars that are studying political content. They are studying the brain systems involved in how humans make sense of complex social information, which is essentially part of what we're going to do today, is break some of those pieces down to make sense for our BrainWise friends. What's happening in this political environment from a neuroscience perspective, regardless of what stance you might take. So let's walk through one of the major brain systems involved in political cognition, the threat system.
It comes back, the main thing comes back to our good old friend, the amygdala. And it's looking for threats, physical threats, social threats, identity-based threats, i.e., if we feel threatened that somebody's actually saying something against something that's very important, where we've got our identity wrapped up in it, then we can get triggered. And again, reminder, what happens when we get triggered is our amygdala lights up, becomes even more aware of looking for threats, and our prefrontal cortex basically gets closed down, which actually dampens down our ability to be rational. It dampens down our ability to have empathy with the other person. It dampens down our self-control. So all of those things that are exactly not what you want to do if you're going to have a discussion are getting triggered off. And that's just the amygdala, because political discussions tend to have that level around there's no right or wrong answer. There's no degree of certainty about what is happening, what's happened, and what is about to happen. We get wrapped up in the Ingroup. If somebody agrees with us, then we have confirmation bias coming up. So all of those things that are going on in our threat systems in the brain are getting triggered 100%. In fact, it's difficult to know, other than when you've got a life-threatening situation, it's difficult to know of another topic that probably triggers off the threat system so much.
And I think a lot of it's probably related to all of those different connections of myself, which I know we're going to get into in a little bit when we talk about the PTP, but my mental models, my upbringing, the things that have happened in my life, or just the overall viewpoint that I might have, is then ultimately what connects so strongly to whether I'm being triggered by one topic or another.
Yeah. And it's exactly the opposite as well, is if you're in a conversation with somebody who you find you're in agreement with, you start feeling that they're just like you and therefore you like them, that you belong to them. We can form an Ingroup. I'm getting validated. Now, all of a sudden, I'm getting exactly the opposite of what happens when I was in the threat state. I'm in a reward state now, and I'm actually feeling good. I found a fellow conspirator. It doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum of politics. If we find that fellow that actually demonstrates exactly the same thinking as we do, Inside the brain, it goes, you're just like me. I'm perfect, therefore you must be perfect. And that's the exchange that happens between the two.
And it also impacts the executive system as well.
Absolutely.
Right?
Prefrontal cortex, executive system, whatever you want to call it. And that's where, if you're in control of your prefrontal cortex, it helps you regulate your emotions. It helps you to do risk assessment. Do I want to say this in public or not? It helps you to understand some of the complexity about what's going on. It evaluates things. It puts things in perspective. It gives you context, all of those type of things. However, don't forget that it's the first of the brain systems that gets clobbered when cortisol comes in and it gets closed down. Although it's the single most useful part of the brain from when you're putting things into perspective, it's also the thing that's first going to go offline under stress.
So when we're triggered, essentially, and cortisol is released, now the executive system's being shut down and our amygdala is on overdrive, trying to perceive threats that are coming into our environment. And it can be difficult and it takes time. I think we've shared in the past 2.5 hours on average, or whatever it is, based off of everyone's individual kind of body chemistry for it to dissipate.
Yeah.
Meaning that it's difficult once you're triggered and that flood hits, it's very difficult to have an agreeable conversation or even a mutually disagreeable conversation that we're going to agree to disagree. That's not usually even possible when both are triggered or even just one.
Yeah. And as you said, it takes a while. And the very, very best thing to do is, like in everything else, if you find yourself getting triggered, is find a nice way of walking away from the discussion. Because by that time, you're not going to have a rational discussion. And in fact, what you may do makes matters worse, in that you start to escalate the emotions, and our ability to actually then evaluate you cognitively and rationally gets diminished. And you start putting memories in place, which now reinforce the fact that the other guy that's just triggered you must be wrong. And therefore, it's even more difficult over time to get away from those feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important that for both sides of that conversation to realize that the person that needs to exit or is making that request to pause the conversation or exit the discussion isn't trying to be rude. Most of the time, the intention is that they're not trying to be rude, especially if they're doing it because they don't want to escalate the discussion. It's because they are ultimately trying to avoid that and then come back at another time. And excuse me, but also how the person demonstrates or asks for that particular pause is also important, right? In terms of, we don't want to blow up or have an exaggerated expression or all of the different things. And so there's a lot that comes into it, but recognizing, especially if you're going to get into that discussion, that these are kind of this is how we're going to exit in the conversation if it gets too heated, and come back to it in the future, which typically only involves someone that you know well. If it's someone you don't know well, you might just have to say, hey, time out, this isn't productive, let's move on.
Yeah, and find your own way of doing that. Just to emphasize, it doesn't matter what your viewpoint is, whether you're right, left, or in the middle, your systems are all behaving the same way. We tend to think that everybody else thinks just like us, and to some degree they are. The processes that are in place are exactly the same across all of us. The actual determination that you decide on what your viewpoint is obviously differs, but the underlying process is exactly the same regardless of your viewpoint.
Exactly. And I think something else that's interesting about this discussion, and maybe we'll talk about it at some point, is what our perceived intention is of what another person, not like us, our intention. And maybe we could talk about that too. But I think another part that gets us so triggered and so heightened in the moment and makes it difficult is, if this person believes X, whether it's one way or another way is irrelevant, then there's this understanding, or there's this internal belief system that their intention must be X. I see a lot of times when having discussions, or I witness others having conversation, is they're arguing a lot of times at an intentional level versus whatever it is that the actual topic was about, which I think gets back to that whole inference, which is probably another way to describe in some degree perceived intention.
Yeah. So the ladder of inference, and I know we've talked about that in the past, is there's a piece of data that occurs. The brain is not very good at keeping all the details. We summarize it. We pass it through all those filters, some of which you talked about earlier on, your mental models, and we reach a conclusion. We summarize the conclusion and reach an inference. And then we argue at the inference level. And that inference
Right.
doesn't necessarily got anything to directly do with the data you started with. The data can be X, Y, Z, and the inference is this other guy's an idiot. And then we start then asking each other, are you stupid, and things like that, which is now guaranteed to inflame. So sometimes it's worthwhile going back. What was the data upon which all this process started? It was actually because someone made a joke, and their intent was to maybe make something lighthearted, and yet we took it the wrong way.
I think, Bill, let's talk about another person. You mentioned his name already, but it goes into a bit more detail, or I will go into a bit more detail here, which is around George Lakoff, I think is how you pronounce his name. He's not a political neuroscience scientist. He's a cognitive linguist, but his work is foundational to this discussion. So help us understand why his work is foundational and ultimately what it will help us do.
Well, so he was one of the first people, I don't know whether he was the first, but he was one of the first people studying the cognitive aspects. He's now looking at what are some of the things that drive our political thought from a cognitive point of view. And he started coming up with the fact that the brain thinks, at least the right hemisphere of the brain, thinks in terms of metaphors. So we translate what is actually happening into a metaphor of what might be happening. And once we've got that metaphor or that sequence of metaphors, he calls it a frame. Once it's activated, it's what we use to interpret all the information. And it's now become a mental model. And it became a mental model. You interpret all the information through that mental model, not because we're stubborn or not because we're saying we're not going to think about anything else. That's the way that our brains are working. So once we get that mental model in our brain that says, this is the way life is around a political scenario or a political environment, that's the model that we interpret everything through. And if it doesn't match our model, guess what? We feel threatened, and that whole threat process starts up again. So we create the model out of metaphors. We then interpret everything through those metaphors, and then we get worried if it doesn't align with what we think.
Very interesting. It makes total sense, especially when we talk about politics, because there's a tremendous amount of mental models and frameworks and just overall things that we are filtering these conversations through. And it can also, I would imagine, this is my hypothesis, but depending on how emotionally charged the experience was that created this frame for us in terms of what we're looking through the world, probably to some degree indicate how emotionally charged we may become if that part of our mental model is being triggered. So if you had a really negative experience with something, it goes back to, we may not remember exactly what has happened to us, but we'll always remember how people made us feel, right? There's that whole phrase that we say, because it's very true. And so I would imagine it's very similar in this space, that if this experience that I went through in life has caused me to believe X, and it was so emotional in the moment that now whenever that part of my mental model is triggered, I'm now responding and probably in equal kind to that particular emotional experience, even though it's not the same experience, it's to some degree triggering off those same pieces of my memory.
Absolutely. And so what's also going on is when we are listening to people talk, whether it be on television or radio or a podcast or someone the other side of a bar or whatever it might be, we tend to talk in terms of metaphors as well. If somebody's on Good Morning America or whatever it might be, and they start talking about a metaphor about what's happening, then that metaphor can get added into our framework, and either positively or negatively is added into that framework. And we start thinking not about the data behind it, but the metaphor itself. And again, that can get us into trouble.
Absolutely, especially if we're interpreting it incorrectly or something that came through isn't what the intention was. There's a whole conversation to be had there, but yeah, it's very important that it comes back again to the inference discussion that we had just previously. What was the actual data point or the actual discussion point of that particular conversation versus some of the other things that our brain is interpreting this information through?
So what I'd challenge all of our BrainWise listeners to do is, first of all, I'm not encouraging everyone to listen to political content or anything like that. But if you choose to, then look for the metaphors that the people are using and look for whether or not that's an objective metaphor, which some of them are, or whether it's got some sort of threat or reward to you personally behind using that metaphor. And just, hey, is it a metaphor? Oh, wow, that's not the actual thing. That's a metaphor for what's going on.
And it's used on every side of the aisle that you might think about from a political perspective. They use metaphors in that way to lend credit to, and credit's probably the wrong word, but to lend emotional conviction probably behind what they're saying. Wherein if you look at the data, you may still feel that way after looking at the particular data point, but maybe you may not feel that same way if you look at the data or the fact. But then the other part that gets really challenging is what's fact, what's not fact, which we're not going to get into that particular discussion today. But it is important to look at it from the lens of which you're talking about, because it allows us to at least look at what is the actual data point, and then from that point, make a distinction as to whether or not we agree with that data point or not.
Yeah, and go back down to as much as you can get to the raw data, the origin of the raw data. Especially if you find yourself getting triggered, don't search for the data at that point, because you're going to interpret it through the threat filter. Wait a couple of hours, between 2 and 5 hours, depending on your metabolism, and wait and go back and say, okay, now let me go back and research that. Oh, it's not quite what I thought.
And nowadays, Phil, I think this particular piece, I don't know if it's an addition or a different way of communicating it, but because we all have cell phones and we're out in the world, and a lot of people look at life through their camera lens, is how I describe it, because I would love to be better at capturing moments, not political ones, but just in life in general, because I'm really terrible at it. There are some people who live their life through the camera lens. And so there's all of these clips and all of this video footage that's well documented about what's being experienced. But what ends up happening, no matter what you watch, who you talk to, there is what do they call it? Clickbait or clip cut or whatever. I don't know what the actual terminology is, but they cut these things in certain ways to frame their political narrative. And the reason why I was thinking about this is because you're talking about metaphors and how metaphors do something very similar, right? Versus looking at the actual fact. Now it's not just the metaphor that they're using to describe it, but then also how they're visually depicting it through how they clip or cut different clips of the experience that just happened.
Yeah. And so the whole thing is about stepping back. And that's why it's important to understand, if you are getting triggered, that ability to step back and use the prefrontal cortex to put things in context rather than that little 2-second clickbait. Step back and go, I wonder what else was going on at the time.
Right.
And
exactly.
And start asking questions of yourself and questioning you question what you're actually listening to, and try and interpret what are the inferences that person's making, what metaphors are they using, and all those type of things, and just step back. Imagine yourself looking down on the conversation. What would you observe if you were the neutral observer?
Exactly. And I think, Phil, this conversation, or the neuroscience of politics, probably fits fairly well in terms of how it maps to the 5P model, or the PTP, personal threat profile, that we've discussed on several occasions. So I'm very curious if we can map some of these things that we're discussing, or the threats that are happening versus rewards, how it maps to the overall 5P model.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that, because it matches perfectly. Because if you look at the first one was protection. And so what the brain is doing is helping us feel protected, or identifying when we feel threat. All these political discussions will activate our threat detection. And if we're under threat, we're going to die. And that's the internal message that goes on. So we react very strongly. We look for safety. The first thing is, do we feel safe? Do we feel like we're going to survive? And our brain systems will accentuate the feeling of safety over the feeling of accuracy. So the first impression we get is, do we feel safe about it? And if we don't get too threatened, if we retain our prefrontal cortex, we can start looking for the accuracy of it. But the first thing is protection. Uncertainty amplifies that. So if we are uncertain about things, i.e. we can't predict, this is one of these occasions when all of these different facets we talk about interact with each other and magnify each other. Sometimes they'll counteract each other, but in this situation, they're more likely to magnify it. We don't know what's going on. We feel threatened, and therefore we look for safety. We disregard the actual data of what's going on, and then we make a story up about how this all hangs together. And then once we've made that story up, we believe it may not necessarily be true. And we use our mental models to try and simplify things. Our biases will fill in the gaps. We'll MSU, make stuff up, as we've said before. And all of those things are going on at the same time. And so you asked about the whole thing. So protection is number one. Prediction, we just talked about. Participation is the next one. We want to belong. And so therefore, when we find a group that we agree with, we go, oh my gosh, I feel safe now. And I'm going to stick with everything they say, even though the accuracy of it might not be fully provable. If you go down to the data, again, may not be there. We're being driven by those processes of protection, participation, and prediction. Agreement, if we get agreement, we actually feel good. Certainty feels good. And again, if we see as something which we interpret as unfair, then that goes back to protection and we don't feel safe. And that unfairness can be either experienced towards ourselves or towards other people that we see as part of our in-group and we're just like, or that we like. If you look at the whole 5P model, you can actually identify what's going on at the protection level, the participation level, the prediction level, pleasure, it feels good, and purpose. All of a sudden, if we're a member of fill in the blank group, that means we've now given ourselves an identity, we've given ourselves a group to belong to, and we love being with people that are just like us.
One of the things that came into my mind is this, and I don't know if it's new or if it's just more prevalent or if social media has highlighted this, but I think it fits in with what you're describing around the entire 5P model, is this conversation around absolutes. And what I mean by that is there is morality in a lot of things, right? We're not going to get into that particular discussion today or the ethics of things, whatever. But there is this internal belief system. And I think part of it is probably how things are depicted, metaphors that are coming together, how it's triggering different parts of our brain through the 5P model. And I think it fits probably a lot within participation in this case, which is if this person has X viewpoint, then there's no way they can be anything but this. And they put this kind of absolute description around people. And maybe it's true, but maybe it's not true. But it's very difficult. And I see this a lot in all areas of the political spectrum where there's this, and you even see it probably in the news media, quite honestly, where they're describing the opposite side in these terms of absolutes, which that's not really the lens in which, looking through things, you have to look at and that's probably at the inference level again. So Phil, thinking around this conversation of absolutes and how it seems to be that, at least me anyways, when I look at, regardless what part of the political spectrum someone might be on, there's this lens that we look through absolutes. We look at the person through absolute filters. And so where is that coming from? Like, how is that manifesting in our mind or in our brain from a neuroscience perspective?
It's a buildup of all sorts of things. There's no one thing that's happening. But if you look at, let's take the ladder of inference, what we talked about 10 minutes ago. Mm-hmm. Once we get an inference about somebody and we have a mental model about them with a metaphor that supports it, then our brains love certainty. So once we've developed this story around the metaphor about who the person is and therefore what they believe and who they are, then it becomes nice and easy for our brains to go, yep, that's it. And so as you describe it, it's from an absolute point of view. There's something else going on in parallel, though. If you watch TV interviews at the moment, very few of them are trained reporters these days that are actually asking objective questions. Many of them are asking what I would call lead the witness questions. Don't you think blah, 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 blah. And so what that does is a couple of things. If it lines up with their belief system, then it makes them feel rewarded and therefore will start pontificating about, yes, that's exactly what I believe, and here's more. But if it lands and somebody doesn't believe that, you've basically done two things. You've anchored something into their brain and our brains as we're listeners. And so now that person, you to a degree, you've put them in a threat state. So now what are they going to do? If they're in a threat state, they're going to respond based on their amygdala-based response. And when we've got the actual act of even what we used to think of objective interviewing on news, that's also disappeared out of the window. And again, I'm not talking right, left, middle, center, purple or red, or any of those colors in between. I'm talking about what's going on in people's brains. This time, the brain of the interviewer and the interviewee.
Absolutely. And I think that's does help explain some of what is happening, because if there's leading questions that are happening or taking place when talking to people, and then we are digesting that information through our own kind of frames, mental models, and overall world views of things, then it ultimately creates this kind of absolute perspective that we view others through, which I know as we get towards the end of our conversation today, we'll talk about some BrainWise tips to go through this experience, both to help manage our own emotional state, because things can trigger us off and create these really negative experiences for us. But then also, how do we look at the world and be able to hopefully bifurcate some of the information that's coming through and look at the data points from that perspective versus all these other things that are happening, which I think leads a great segue into the next part of our discussion, which is let's talk about the biases that are showing up in political thinking. Again, not tied to any necessary viewpoint. And for our BrainWise friends who are listening, if this is your first or second or third episode, we did a conversation about biases early on in our podcast in season 1. I think it was episode 2, 3, 4, somewhere in there. It might be helpful, Phil, for us to just mention a little blurb around biases, because that word in particular can also trigger some individuals just due to experiences that they've had. So let's lay a quick framework of what that means in our world from a neuroscience perspective, and then go into it from a cognitive bias and neuropolitical thinking perspective.
Yeah. So biases in general are the brain's way of handling things automatically so that we don't have to think about them. So they're laid down at some point in time whereby we just go, oh, if this happens, X, Y, Z, therefore this happens. And we take it through a bias process. We've identified, I don't know what the latest number is, but let's say 270 biases. There's several hundred well-established biases that we are all, I'll say, guilty of, but guilty is the wrong word, because they are they're the brain's quick fix to understanding what's going on. So the actual fact that we have biases, we've all got them. We all have a lot of them. And it doesn't mean we're bad people. That's just the way that the brain works. And there's some that tend to be more prevalent. And so probably the most commonly known is what's called confirmation bias. And we seek information and we hear information that most fits our beliefs. In actual fact, we filter out things that don't match that. And it's called confirmation bias. We all have it. And so therefore, we tend to go back to the same channels that we've got information from, because we know that channel is going to talk about some things that fit our beliefs. So we actually direct our attention to those things that we're going to feel rewarded by, because, hey, it's saying what we believe. There's a thing called Ingroup bias, a behavior, outgroup behavior. We favor the opinions of people that are just like us and that we like. And if somebody's talking on the TV about something and we can relate to that person and we are feeling the same way that they're doing, all of a sudden, we may not know them, but we become part of their in-group. It's not that dissimilar. In fact, I believe, I'm not a great football fan, but I believe that the Super Bowl is coming up this weekend. So whether it is the Patriots and the Seahawks or something like that, you'll start to see people getting bifurcated in people who support this team versus the people who support this team. You're seeing an exact replica of what goes on in the political spectrum, but it's actually around sports. So again, same brain process going on. If you're a Seahawks fan, then you must be fill in the blank. If you're a a Patriots fan, then you must be fill in the blank. And we've got the same thing going on. And you mentioned earlier on, it becomes absolute. We don't tend to think back and go, oh, they're actually just like they're another human being, just like me. We attribute all sorts of things. And that's the next thing. It's called attribution error. When we're doing something or a member of our in-group is doing something, we say it's because of the situation and they didn't have a choice. Whereas when we see the same exact behavior with other people, we attribute to them it must be because of their behavioral characteristics or their disposition at the time. It's called attribution. We attribute things differently to people that we like and are part of our in-group to those that we don't like and part of the out. When we're talking about people in our out-group, we don't cut them a break. We don't turn around and like we would if you and I were talking and you say something, I'll give you a break about it because I love you. We don't give those people who are in the out-group the same breaks.
100%. And we also we as an individual might do the exact same behavior that we see someone else do, but we're justifying it in our own lens because of our moral compass or ethics or whatever it is that we are using to justify, regardless of whether or not it's right or wrong, is irrelevant at this point. But it happens. We do it even in our own space, which I know you had mentioned, that we can, as an individual, I will behave in a certain way, but then I'll look at someone else and make all kinds of other inferences about the way that they're showing up, even though I did the exact same thing.
Yep, exactly. And that's called attribution error. And I'll mention two others. One is once we've got our mind made up about something, we make up stories about why it must be true. And so the brain is really good at making up stories and inventing stories which we then convince ourselves are true. So we're motivated to explain things to justify the end result that we're looking for. And again, it's a bias. And when we talk about biases, these are happening most of the time non-consciously, and they're happening in split seconds. So it's not something you go, oh, I'm biased, therefore. No, it's happening in your non-conscious brain. And the last thing I'll talk about is what we call loss aversion. We hate losing things, whether that's our identity. We've seen study after study when if you've got let's say you're invested in the stock market and you've got a particular stock and you see it go down by 5 points, let's say, that creates infinitely more panic than the equivalent of it going up. And so what we tend to do is because that stock's gone down, we start to build a story. I'll just wait till it comes back up. And we follow it down into the ground as opposed to saying, wait a minute, no. And there's tips on how we do that, but that's another topic. But again, we hate the loss of status, hate the loss of our personal identity. And that's what's involved if somebody were to even get to the point where they go, oh, maybe I need to change my opinion. Our identity has become so wrapped up in there that we don't want to lose that part of our identity. Therefore, we don't change our opinion. And again, that feeds back into that absolute loop you were talking about earlier on.
And I think it's important to mention these aren't partisan, the one side or the other. It's all sides of any political spectrum or really any part of the conversation where there might be a difference of opinion on something. These things are showing up, which means that they're human because they do show up in every domain. Politics happens to activate them strongly because of all the things that are happening in this over heightened kind of political space that we're in oftentimes. And then sometimes the emotional severity to which we experience some of the things that shape our political view. And I think it's important to mention that just like we mentioned in several other podcasts where, for example, the way a retail store is set up is very much related to how, from a neuroscience perspective, the neuroscience of buying something. There are experts in those things. And even in this field of political science, regardless of what side of the aisle, that allow one to frame conversation, to frame the way things come across so that it plays on these parts of our brain. And it can be really challenging to look at the data points that are coming in. Again, going back to the inference level of looking at a conversation, it can be challenging because of how things are framed and shaped for all of us.
Yeah. And so we've prided ourselves, I think that's the correct word, in turning around and saying, how do we translate this all into something that people can actually do something about? And It is.
Were you reading my mind, Phil? Because my next question was going to be, what do we do with all this?
I think after we've done this number of podcasts together, we probably are reading each other's mind.
Right, we are.
But
does that mean we have an in-group bias, Phil?
Yeah, 2 is the smallest group we can have. So,
right.
Except that occasionally in my brain, I think there's several people in there.
Oh, mine too. I'm sure that our BrainWise friends can pick out the characters popping up of each of us.
I think they probably can. How do we do? Well, what do we do with all this? First of all, and I'm going to make this statement. It sounds ludicrous. If you find that political discussions are bothering you, causing you stress, causing you to lose sleep, or causing you to not focus, or whatever it is, however it's manifesting itself, avoidance is a really good strategy. Or just so you don't turn the TV on if you know that in 30 minutes time, it's just going to have made your blood boil. Don't turn it on. The second thing is divide up between what you can change, what you might be able to influence, and what I'll call the law of physics. Nothing you can do about it. And focus on those things that you can do. If you can have a discussion with your significant other, go have that discussion. If you can't, if it's going to make you the blood boil on both sides, don't do it. If you can write to your favorite politician and you think that's something that you might be able to influence, go for it. But recognize where the limits of your influence are. And really, is it going to change anything by you getting triggered? Probably not for most of us. Avoidance is a really good thing. If you can keep your prefrontal cortex in control, and that's really what it's about, then you can slow the discussion down so that you've got an opportunity to think things through. Step away from the conversation if you find that you're getting triggered, so that you give your brain the greatest chance of actually coming back online, your prefrontal cortex. Just when you're in I'll call it an adult to adult conversation, try remaining curious and asking open-ended questions so that you remain curious rather than be certain of what you think are the facts, when in fact those facts may not be. Asking somebody what led you to that conclusion is not a bad way. And just opening up the conversation. How did you reach that? Where did that information come from? And lots of questions you can ask about those sort of things. So remaining in that.
And I think, Phil, really quick, related to what you were just describing is that when you are asking these questions or you're having these conversations, to the degree that it's possible, I think reminding yourself it's not personal. If you're asking a conversation, and I know that's very difficult because the mental models that we have and all the things that are going on, but if we can stand back and objectively view it, and actually this is done something they advise in marriage counseling where you put the problem on the table or on the chair so that you're looking objectively at the problem versus fighting the other person. I think if you can separate, and it's not that especially if you're going to ask these questions, I think that's really important that you try to remind ourselves, this isn't personal. It's not a personal attack against me. And if we're unable to do that because of the particular topic, maybe just avoid digging any further into that particular part of the conversation.
Yeah. And I think in our business, when I'm facilitating groups, I wait for 7 seconds. I count them in my head. So if you can do that when we are faced with something and count to 7 before we react, that's not a bad way of doing things. It gives the brain a little bit of a chance to go, what do I actually want to do here? Do I want to respond, or do I want to walk away, or do I want to just change the subject? Or in some cases, do I want to create some humor, which will actually, adjust the level of intensity of the conversation? Stepping back and reacting, we talked about listening for metaphors that are being talked about in the newspapers or the magazines or the news articles on TV. What are the metaphors that you as an individual use, both for the people that think like you do and for the people that don't think like you do?
No, I think it's powerful. These are some really great tips because it is right now, and maybe it's been this way for a while, but it feels like things are at a heightened level of sensitivity when politics are brought up. And I think I'll just make one statement. I would highly avoid these conversations at work entirely, just as an FYI. I think that if possible, it's best to do that because you have to work together well. And it's just not probably the place to do it. You don't want to end up in the HR leader's office as a result of a conversation. But then when you are, how you manage these discussions outside of that environment in a more social setting to ensure that you protect your sanity, your emotional state. But then also, I love the one where you talked about remain curious, curiosity over certainty. I think it's really interesting because in all things, if we can remain curious, we may not agree with one's position on something, but we can certainly learn something about that other person. It tells us a little bit about their thinking. It tells us a little bit about the overall situation. If we can go into it with a bit more of a curiosity perspective versus an absolute or certainty perspective.
Yeah, and there's some other mental models which is buried underneath those statements. And one of them is if you make a statement X to me, just because I ask you a question and go into curiosity about it, we tend to think that, oh, he's therefore going to assume I agree with him. Right. As opposed to, no, you don't have to agree. To remain in curiosity, by the way, I've got a different opinion over here. But I'm going to go into curiosity because I want to find out what led you to that opinion. Yet we have a mental model, many of us, where if we don't immediately contradict what's happening, then you're going to assume I agree with you. That's not the case. Separate those things out, remaining in curiosity versus I'm in agreement. And that can often help a conversation go, you've probably heard me say this. I'll often say, I've got an opinion on that, but I'd like to hear your opinion first. So it helps people, our BrainWise friends, anchor the fact that, yes, I've got an opinion. I'm not going to declare it yet. I might agree with you. I might not agree with you, but I've got an opinion. Anchor that over here. Now I'd like to be in curiosity with you.
Absolutely. And I think on the reverse end is that people don't have to agree with your particular position on whatever the topic is in order for you to be able to move forward in the conversation in a respectful, kind, compassionate, curious way either. I think a lot of times there's this word that gets thrown around, respect, different discussions, in that there's this mental model that I've seen pop up in conversations, mainly probably outside of the political space, but maybe even in there too, is that if you don't agree with me on this, then you don't respect me. And that's not true, right? I can agree with you or disagree with you and still respect you the same. It's just that we have difference of opinion. And I personally am someone who believes that differing opinions is what makes the world so beautiful. There is this diverse population of people in all ways that allow, and if we can function well together and still have difference of opinions, ultimately it's what's going to create this beautiful society that allows us to accomplish these amazing things. When we all become a monolith, then that's when there is challenges in how we proceed as a society moving forward.
We're not going to change society today, but what we can help people do is understand the neuroscience that drives all of us. And that's what we're about today. We're not trying to describe you one way or the other, make you more or less partisan. What we're trying to do is give you some opportunities to become more aware, basically a little more grounded, maybe a little more empathetic, maybe a little more curious, but always be BrainWise.
Absolutely. And to see things from the perspective of others, right? In terms of, you now know what's happening from a neuroscience perspective for yourself. The same thing's happening for other people, right? So hopefully it'll help make sense of maybe what's happening, because sometimes the things that are happening around us don't make a whole lot of sense. So
I'm going to tie one other thing back, and we're going to go back into conversation we have about influence. And you might remember Cialdini's work. He turns around and talks about reciprocity, that if you give someone a gift, they tend to be more likely to give you a gift back. So that gift may be a gift of listening. It may be a gift of curiosity. It may be the gift of empathy. Whatever it might be, you can give that gift, and you can be first to do it.
Yep. Absolutely. I love it. I think it's a perfect place to end our conversation today, because there's been there's been a rich discussion on the neuroscience of politics. And so if you have questions or things of this conversation that really interest you, reach out to us at questions@mybrainwisecoach.com. Or if you want to challenge some of the assumptions that we've made, we welcome all of it, because this is a rich dialogue that is not a monolith. There's a lot of ways that we want to have conversation with you. So share with us, type in the comments, if there's things that you want to talk about and that you don't mind others seeing. And then, of course, if you enjoy our podcast and enjoy today's episode, rate and review us on your favorite podcast listening app, and then comment, share, and subscribe, because we want others to be able to become BrainWise as well. So with that, until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always
stay BrainWise.